Yes, thank you. Good morning. Thank you, first of all, the conference organizers for your very kind invitation for me to participate in this very, very important event. And I'm very honored to be able to speak to many old friends and new friends. First of all, I have to say that this is my personal view. It doesn't represent the view from China, certainly not, but probably the arguing line is along the Chinese thinking. So first of all, I have to say that I have about 5 parts of my talk. Each will be mentioned and analyzed very, very briefly. The first is strategic context of the new world order, or the so-called new norm. It is being reshaped by two ongoing crises and one latent crisis. The 2 ongoing crises you all know very, very clearly. That is the Russian war and the ongoing COVID pandemic. These 2 black swan events, as I understand or believe, are relatively temporary and controllable as compared with the latent crisis in terms of the intensified bloc competition and even bloc confrontation. Please, next slide, please. Next slide, please. Sorry, next. Okay, yeah. The emerging new Cold War type bloc competition are very much rooted in Russo-NATO and Sino-US confrontation. They are truly global, long-lasting, and more profound in terms of generating negative impact on the international order. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yes. Now, this is a very gloomy, bleak international situation. So we see worrying features of this new norm that could be defined as another Cold War type, as I mentioned earlier. Now, first, I just concentrate just a few aspects of this kind of confrontational new norm from the military and the defense perspective, because this conference is really about the regional and the global security and national defense. The first one is basically the bloc competition has been visibly militarized. The most dangerous thing is that the top powers, have not waged any war, not because they have a willingness to prevent the war or for stabilizing the international situation, but the war hasn't been conducted among the top powers, largely based on their calculation of the cost. That is quite expedient, but unreliable type of measures of war prevention. So we see military brinkmanship has become a useful tool to maximize pressure on the opponents, and the challenges to most of the relevant parties in this competition has been highlighted by the hot war in the Ukraine under the nuclear clause, and we see possibility of a mad clash of top powers. To us, to our people in Asia, this similar armed conflict could happen elsewhere in the world, and a war in Asia is no longer unthinkable. I think Professor Wesley may remember that about 10 years ago, we had a debate in Australia that whether a war in Asia was possible or not. I think at that time, most of people did not believe that the war in Asia was possible, but now they may have changed their mind. Next slide, please. Okay, the next part is my talk on the Sino-Russian relationship. Now, again, I will concentrate on the strategic and the security aspect. The two countries define their relationship as strategic realignment, strategic alignment. The word strategic, you're all familiar in Japan. In Japanese kanji, it really means security and military cooperation. We see the enhanced military cooperation in several ways. I will elaborate a little bit later, but this relationship is really based on the so-called shared strategic interests and the common goal in shaping the international order based on a concept or concept of powers. To their understanding, this concept or concept of power, which is not the same as we talk about it in Australia about 10 years, 20 years ago. Now, it's really about the construction of multipolarity, which has a clear aim to deconstruct the so-called unipolarity of the US-dominated international order. But at the same time, I also have to emphasize that the relationship between China and Russia is not one of the military alliance. And this is the reason why we see China has given Russia probably spiritual comfort or to some extent moral support to their war effort in Ukraine, but China has never given any material support to Russia in this regard. Now, this is a reason, this is based on their Chinese calculation, that each has to act freely in order to avoid a situation where they are dragged into something they don't want to get into. And the relationship is also based on generally complementary economic ties. China imports Russian oil and energy products, and China sells a lot of we call the daily necessity goods and services to Russia. So they form a relatively mutually beneficial trade relationship. On the other hand, we see no common ideological ground between the two countries, certainly not shared values. We all know alliance or alignment with common ideological or value basis that would be relatively shaky in endurance and in its solidarity. So we also see real and potential conflicts of interest. Whether this conflict of interest is structural or not, we still have debate over it. At this moment, we can't see it is a structural, but there are elements that could be defined as structural. I don't have time to elaborate further. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of military and security cooperation, we see the two-way military sales and the cooperative R&D for key weapon systems. This is something new probably to your ears, that we all believe that the military cooperation between China and Russia was one way, that was the Chinese purchase of Russian arms. But now it is different. Probably China would have more potential to sell sophisticated weapon system to Russia. We see the table has turned. And it is also reflected by the sophistication of the joint war games conducted between the two militaries. Now, you all know, you're all experts in military affairs. You know that some anti-submarine warfare requires the sharing of very sensitive military information, intelligence information code, for example, coded the communication signals and so on and so forth, and mutual support in their territorial disputes with the third parties. We see China leans towards Russia with Japan in their territorial disputes, although China's leaning towards Russia is not that open, is not openly announced, and basically conducted in kind of a joint military exercises in the areas that Japan would regard to be very sensitive. And we also see Russian support to China over the Taiwan issues. Next slide, please. Now, this is China's position towards the Russian war in Ukraine. I have to say that this is only my assessment, not from the state policy, but on the whole, I think China has been caught in a very plight situation in such a war. It is quite awkward. Although China is very sympathetic to Russia, as China believes that Russia has been provoked into action, but the general attitudes or unpronounced or unannounced policies or even sentiments were that China was opposed to such a war because such a war has worsened unnecessarily the already troubled external environment for China to develop internally and to conduct global power diplomacy. The war has restricted China's options in China's external efforts, external pursuits. So the question is really hope for a short war, a protracted war. Of course, each has its own merits and defects. To China, I will elaborate a little bit more on this point a little bit later. But the opposition for China to oppose such a war, the logic is very, very simple. Because China is a big loser of the war, just like the European countries and even Japan. I think the war only has two visible winners, which are actually the United States and India. Other countries all suffered very painfully from the war. As far as China is concerned, Ukraine is China's largest trading partner. Sorry, China is Ukraine's largest partner, and China has invested billions of dollars in Ukraine. And it seems to me all these kind of money has been wiped out. And China is subject to secondary sanctions, and the trade has been reduced to minimum. This is one of the reasons why China has started to pursue acquired diplomacy, probably in the hope to facilitate the early exit of Russia from the war. And of course, this effort has to be multilateral, with the support, with the cooperation from other countries, including Japan. And of course, European countries are very, very important in this kind of joint effort to end the war. So there is a clear, preference as far as the war is concerned. Russia should not fall. This is largely because the situation or the so-called the Cold War type bloc confrontation. In this confrontation, China and Russia on the same side. If Russia is fallen, then China would have to resist such a kind of Cold War bloc pressure by itself, which will make China very difficult to do. So even if Russia does not achieve what it wants in Ukraine, there has to be a relatively safe exit of Russia from the war, that the new Cold War international situation or new norm would be relatively stable rather than more devastating. Next slide, please. And on the US factor, the trilateral relationship between Washington, Beijing, and Moscow raise a lot of questions in this slide. And probably I don't have time to elaborate all of them or give the answers to all of them. Now we start to talk again the strategic triangular as we did in the Cold War era. But in that time, Dr. Kissinger seemed to have a formula that is the winning formula of 2 against 1. And whether this formula is still working is everyone's guess. But Kissinger again raised his concern that if China and Russia are together, at least it would burden the United States a lot or more. Therefore, the strategic triangular in favor of the 2 is still a strategic issue now for the US and its allies to consider. Secondly, a war weakened Russia still appear military power, seen by the NATO powers. The question probably yes, but this is not the issue. The issue is really a weakened Russia or crippled Russia is a more dangerous Russia. Now, this is common sense that we should not corner any nuclear power in the back. We should not back any nuclear powers in the corner. Now, this is not for what we call the moral purposes, but is simply reflect the fact that world security and peace requires that we cannot push the envelope to the extreme, and the major power interaction should be left with a leeway for compromise. And the third one, can the US fight a 2-front war simultaneously? Yes, probably at much higher level of cost. And the next one, when Washington's focus is placed on European theater at this moment, would China have a much larger maneuvering space in Asia? The answer probably yes as well. So that is one of the reason why I raised this question earlier, that whether the war is preferred to last longer or should stop as quickly as possible. Finally, just to say the Indo Pacific military redeployment of the US and its allies have visibly slowed down by the war. How visible it is, I think is everyone's guess or everyone's judgment. But I would think that without the war, probably America could concentrate more easily and more strategically on the Asia, on the Indo-Pacific arena. Next slide, please. Now this, because I'm required to do the connection between the Ukraine war, the strategic triangular, in the context of Indo-Pacific strategy and the framework. So this is my summary. One overall strategy, 2 primary defense lines, 3 core institutional settings, 4 geopolitical connecting pillars. I don't have time to elaborate all of them. I just say the among the 4 geostrategic competing connecting pillars, one that is very important as far as the Chinese are concerned, that is Japan and Australia as the strategic anchorage of US forward deployment in the region. Now, these 2 strategic anchorage, I think Professor Beasley may recall that about 10, 12 years ago, a Chinese analyst, a Chinese correspondent in Canberra, he used this metaphor that the two anchorages were actually two paws in the crab, so which indicates very hostile intentions. Therefore, we see the very specific division of labor in the maybe armed conflict between China and the United States, that Australia is tasked to cut off the Chinese southern route, we call sea lanes of communications, and Japan should be involved in supporting American operations in the Taiwan Strait. So for China, this IP framework strategy and structure is quite dangerous one, because it has pushed the security confrontation in the region in the upward spiral, and probably the end of it would be the war. Okay, please turn the next slide. Okay, China's response to U.S. Indo Pacific offensive. Definitely, I use this word offensive on this issue. China is on defensive and the U.S. is on offensive. I think this is not a controversial point. So China has waged its own counteroffensive with its own multilateralism. Now we just witnessed the leadership diplomacy in G7, in the East Asia Summit, in APEC Summit. The Chinese President Xi Jinping engaged all most important regional leaders, including President Biden and the Japanese Prime Minister, and of course Australian Prime Minister. And how effective this counteroffensive is, I think probably not too much, but China is not sitting idle. So that is very, very important. One of the countermeasures, as I mentioned earlier, has been China and Russia forming a more cooperative relationship in the military field. Okay, the next slide, please. Okay, that is the conclusion. The emerging new Cold War is becoming increasingly hot. That is to say, we have to rethink about the word Cold War. Probably this is more dangerous than the first Cold War. In the Cold War era, when there was we call the mad parity between the two blocs, and today the military strength between the two blocs is uneven in favor of the U.S. and allies, that could make stimulate the Washington and its allies to think of taking preemptive actions. I just don't think that would be easy, but the logic can be thought in such a way. I have already mentioned the second point, the China and Russia joint effort to manage the common security challenges in the short run. And of course, in the long run, the bilateral relationship could be redefined under very different circumstances. My worry is really we see the rising prospects of Asian proxy war. And finally, that is our duty in the field of security and military studies, that we should engage, we should contribute to crisis prevention and the crisis management. Okay, thank you very much. That's the end.